I'll leave you with that.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so as Susan said, I'm the director of CDC's Arctic Investigations Program. So my focus is usually through the human lens, but we do understand the importance of the three pillars of One Health. But again, our mission in the Arctic is to prevent or reduce the morbidity and mortality from infectious diseases for the peoples of the Arctic. So I'm going to start off and talk to you a little bit about the International Circumpolar Surveillance System for Invasive Bacterial Diseases, and then just speak very briefly about collaborative One Health research in the Arctic. It's by no means exhaustive. I don't really have the time. So I'm going to start off. This is a slide showing a representation of the countries participating in international circumpolar surveillance. It's basically an infectious disease surveillance network of hospitals and public health laboratories across the Arctic. And you can see here in gray the countries that are represented that participate in this network. And it's really, we call it a circumpolar surveillance network. It's really kind of hemipolar because we don't have Russia in this network. But Russia actually does participate in our tuberculosis surveillance network for ICS, which we sort of see as a separate thing. This is invasive bacterial disease. I don't have time to talk to you about TB, maybe at coffee breaks if you want to hear about that. So these are the current members listed here, and these are the different organisms for which we do surveillance across the Arctic. So it's invasive disease caused by Streptococcus pneumonia, Haemophilus influenza, Neisseria meningitis, groups A and B strep. Most countries participate and submit data on all these different organisms, but a couple countries submit their own different numbers of bugs. So that's the surveillance system. It started in 1999, so we're at our 20th year anniversary. It's a surveillance system that uses the network of surveillance within the existing countries and then networks all of those networks into one site where data is collected and analyzed. And we also have a quality control program. One could imagine that across the Arctic, the testing in the laboratories is not uniform for these bugs. And so if different labs are doing different tests, are those comparable data? So we have a system that's in place many times a year where we're doing quality control, and one lab is sending out the organisms to another lab to see what they get and look and see how they match up. So we do quality control across the network on a regular basis, and it's actually matched up very, very closely. So I'm just going to show you a few slides on some of the data we get out of this network. So this is some data on invasive pneumococcal disease in children less than 5 in a pre-vaccine period before we introduced the PCV13 vaccine, and a post-vaccine period. And the pre-period is shown in yellow, the post is in orange. And you can see that with introduction of this vaccine, we saw statistically significant, dramatic declines in invasive disease in Alaska Native children. And we saw the same thing for PCV13 type disease in non-Native children. So really dramatic effects from this vaccine, and we're able to monitor those effects through this surveillance network across the Arctic. This is just Alaska as an example, but I also want to note, you can see this is a disparity that continues. Even though we've had this 89% decline, you can see that the rates in Alaska Native children are still significantly higher than non-Native children, and that's a common theme. Some other data, just to show you a little bit of data on Haemophilus influenza. We had a very successful campaign with Hib vaccine, and essentially really brought the Hib rates down very, very low, Haemophilus influenza serotype B. But through this network, we've identified a novel serotype, Haemophilus influenza serotype A, that's really causing a problem in Alaska and northern Canada. And we have the highest rates in the world of this disease in children. It's quite a severe disease. And you can see that 11% of cases die. About a third of them require hospital transfer, almost 80% air transport, 36% of them require ICU or die before admission, and 14% have sequelae or disease complications a year or more after the disease. So if these children do survive this very, very serious disease, many of them have hearing loss, speech loss, or paralyzed in half their body. So very, very significant disease. in children. This network allowed us to identify an outbreak, the first outbreak identified for this, unless you consider one, we had a small outbreak early on, but this is a recent outbreak that occurred in 4 cases in one village. I'm not going to go through the details of this, I don't have time, but it also enables us to pick up outbreaks within a jurisdiction or cross-border jurisdictions. This disease, the Canadians were way ahead of us. They realized the importance of this disease early on, and the National Research Council in Canada created a conjugate vaccine for this disease and showed that we can have a vaccine, tested it in mice and rabbits, showed it to be immunogenic and bactericidal, and right now they're shooting for phase 1 trials in Lower Canada to test a vaccine, and they're looking for a vaccine company to pick it up. And we in Alaska are hoping if there is a vaccine developed, we'll be able to use it and protect children in our population. So that's all I have to say for ICS, because I'm quite limited in my time, I realize. I'm gonna I apologize for how much stuff's on this slide, but I'm trying to get through stuff quickly. So I'm just gonna go through a few collaborative One Health research projects in the Arctic. One of the things that came out of international circumpolar surveillance, we would meet every year over these 20 years, and we can only cover so many infections. And so there was a group really interested in hepatitis, and so we formed a hepatitis research group across the Arctic. There was a group interested in Helicobacter. We have a Circumpolar Helicobacter research group. We have a research group on tuberculosis across the circumpolar countries, and we have a circumpolar, the most recent group that formed is a Circumpolar Climate Change and Infectious Disease Working Group. So members across the Arctic come and discuss shared interests and projects. We learn from each other in this group. And I actually haven't been able to participate in the last few years in this group, but I talked to the former chair of the group, and the latest thing they're working on, which I think is quite important, is to do a survey across all the Arctic countries and look at 15 different, what they think are climate sensitive, reportable infectious diseases in the Arctic, to get a sense of what is even reportable across the different countries for these diseases that we potentially anticipate are going to be on the rise with climate change. What countries are even reporting it? And it's going through and getting information from these countries in a survey to allow us to sort of see where the gaps are, who's doing what, and I think it's probably a really nice start. All the data has come in for that. It's being analyzed right now. There should be a report out in the next year, and then possibly a publication if they're interested in that. That's not my group. I'm going to mention here, we did a sero survey in Alaska. We were thinking, okay, there are probably a number of organisms, we tested for all of these organisms listed below here. There are probably a number of organisms as the climate warms that could increase in our population. We have no idea what the baseline is in human beings for many of these diseases. So we went and we did sero surveys. We drew blood from a number of different populations in Alaska, rural hunters, their children, their families, sports hunters, research biologists with lots of contact with wildlife, and then controls in Bethel and Anchorage who don't have exposures to wildlife, to look and see what the prevalence of antibodies to these are. And so we're trying to do this to kind of set a baseline to see what we have, and to see in later years when we look what's increased or what hasn't. And I believe that this is not my study, but I believe the CLIMF project that I know Dr. Evangard is very involved in, I believe they're actually doing a similar thing, looking at seroprevalence in populations in Sweden and Greenland. Yeah, so that's exciting to me. That's all I'm going to say about that. And then I'm going to mention just briefly, we had an Alaska Zoonotic Prioritization workshop in Fairbanks earlier this year. We thought to ourselves, we really need to sort out and figure out what are our zoonotic priorities related to climate warming that are important for Alaska. And so we had this meeting, and I'm just going to go very quickly through these slides. I'm not going to go through all these, but it's a number of steps. There are qualitative steps, there are semi-quantitative steps. You spend, basically it's a 2-day procedure. I participated in the first day of this, but not the second. in which you have a list of your organisms. I'm going to show you. Well, that's just the goals. So you come up with a list of what you think your priority organisms are. And so within that group, a very diverse group, we came up with a list of 35 zoonotic diseases that you see listed here. These are the participating organizations. You can see it has representation from human health, animal health, the environment. We tried to make it very, very broad. And we came up with 5 criterion that we needed to apply to every single one of those organisms. And then there's a whole nother process. It gets ranked and graded numerically. It goes into a program, and it spits out eventually your top top priority diseases according to what you came up with. And there are many publications on this now. This is mostly run there's a group in CDC in Atlanta that has done these exercises in places across the world. So if you're interested in more information on this, I'd be happy to share it with you, and it's very well documented. But this is what we came up with for Alaska. These are like our top 7 zoonotic diseases that have come out of this exercise. And so our next step that we've taken and are working on right now is to do landscape reviews for these. And so far we've finished 3 landscape reviews for what's highlighted there in yellow. And basically a landscape review is going in and looking at the literature, what is published on this across the Arctic and specifically within our jurisdiction in Alaska. What do we know? What surveillance is being done? How is it being tested for, et cetera? And we're trying to sort of lay a baseline for these to get a better understanding of them. And we're hoping to bring back these representatives I showed you from multidisciplinary groups to discuss each of these in a separate meeting to figure out what are our priorities for moving forward with this. And I think that's it. I know I'm very short on time, tried to keep it quick and simple, but that's it for me.